All right, testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today is November 5th, and we have a lot to report on the news. I'm going to share my screen here. I think it's not sharing, so give me one moment here, and I'll get that up for you all. Okay, there we go. So we have a lot of news to cover today. The three biggest things that came up on the news today is the jobs report that really had the stock market soaring today after the major tech sell-off that occurred yesterday, So that's one of the biggest things that happened in the market. Another big thing that happened was the Supreme Court justices heard arguments in a potential case to remove the tariff policy that the Trump administration has enacted. And this is monumental because this is one of the administration's biggest priorities in bringing wealth to the United States, according to their agenda, according to what that administration is stating. People can have different opinions about it, but that's the goal of the administration of President Trump. And there's a potential that this could unravel for the president if the justices vote in the majority against the executive branch having power to unilaterally, enact tariffs on a worldwide scale. So we're going to get into that as well. Thirdly, there's a lot more news than just three, but the thirdly news is that the government shutdown is officially at its longest period in American history. And I think this is something that we need to really pay attention to. I think a lot of people have kind of gotten used to the government getting shut down and sort of are sort of numb to it. At least the people that aren't federal workers aren't directly impacted by these tariffs. So we're getting into that news. And then finally, we're going to get into Apple reaching a deal with Google, a big artificial intelligence deal. I think it's going to cost Apple over $1 billion to have artificial intelligence added on to the Siri application on the iPhone. So that's another big thing that they're doing to move and advance their technological systems with AI. So those are the four top news stories. I may get into more later on, but again, please like, share, subscribe to the channel, comment your thoughts below, and thank you all for listening and watching right now. So let's get into the first news. And again, if you were watching any part of my show last night, you'll see that I've covered an article that stated that there would likely be an optimistic jobs report, and that jobs report came out today. So according to the ADP, the payroll processor, private companies added about 42,000 jobs in October, a fresh data point that highlights continued tightness in the labor market, but one that is better than some previous months. And it's not only better than previous months, but it's better by a long shot because we haven't had a positive jobs growth since July, which is, it feels like forever ago when you really think about it. The DP report, which does not include the public sector workers and only covers employment at private companies, is one of the few data points available as the government shutdown drags on. Because again, ADP is a separate entity from the government. So that's why this is one of the few reports that the stock market can react to. And it's not as comprehensive as the government jobs reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we need to keep that in mind because, again, what are we seeing right now? We're seeing that the stock market is reacting to very limited data, very limited news due to the government shutdown. And also the Federal Reserve is enacting its monetary policy on very limited data, such as cutting interest rates this month cutting interest rates in October and very likely cutting interest rates in December, which we're going to get into as well. So definitely a lot of interesting things are in right now in this Q4 market of 2025 in a very up and down year. So let's see. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed that only 22,000 jobs were added in August, and that was after it was revised down, hiring in June and July by thousands. And for those of you who don't remember, that's when President Trump fired the Bureau of Labor Statistics commissioner and brought in someone else, and he still had the same exact thing to say, that the jobs were in contraction. The BLS said that in June, the labor market was in contraction with 13,000 roles being shed. So that's one of the biggest reasons why the Federal Reserve has been cutting interest rates in its last two meetings and likely going to do it a third time. by 25 basis points to stir up the jobs market. Now, that does risk raising inflation, because what we saw when back in the pandemic in 2020, when the Federal Reserve drastically cut interest rates to stir up the economy during a pandemic, obviously that was really good for homeowners to refinance or people to purchase a home. But in the long run, it was really difficult because it raised the inflation rate over 8%, causing groceries and lots of other items to skyrocket. So Americans don't want this to be a repeated cycle again if the Federal Reserve actually continues to cut interest rates that aggressively. Now, from what I'm seeing, it doesn't look like they're going to cut interest rates that aggressively. It's going to be 25 basis points on multiple times, but we're going to see. We're going to see what happens. I'm very curious to see what will transpire with this, especially when the government gets more, or the Federal Reserve receives more data. But I digress. So let's see who Richardson is. So Richardson is a chief economist at ADP. So Neela Richardson says, quote, that pay growth has been largely flat for over a year, indicating that shifts in supply and demand are balanced. So this is interesting. So year over year pay growth was flat in October. That means no gain or loss. Oh, apologies for that. So no gain or loss. I can't even highlight here. I forget about that. I'll just leave it there. So it was flat in October from the month prior at 4.5% for job stayers and 6.7% for job changers. So, and again, that's a really big deal when we have inflation starting to creep up, not at the rates of 2020 or 2022, but inflation is starting to creep up. And when you have stagnant pay, a struggling labor force, that is not going to bode well for the economy and really for the Trump administration, because his policies are directly affecting a lot of the inflation rates. And at least polling shows that, if you look at the recent polls regarding the tariff policy and how Americans are feeling about that. So let's continue here. Analysts surveyed by Dow Jones expected that the ADP report would show 22,000 jobs in October, a sharp reversal from 32,000 jobs that were lost in September. So going from a net loss to a gain. However, ADP said that September job losses were revised up slightly to 29K, to a loss of 29,000. So not too much of a revision, but somewhat nevertheless. Let's see if there's anything else here. There's a lot of information here. So 3 in 4 workers in the United States, approximately, according to The Economist here, work in a smaller firm with a headcount of under 250. So seeing weakness and softness there is a concern when you think of the U.S. labor force population in its entirety. And then, obviously, one of the biggest things that's really hurt the economy is the major layoffs that have occurred with UPS and Amazon. These two companies, from what I've seen, man, I gotta get a mouse. Let's see. So these two companies, UPS and Amazon, using artificial intelligence to streamline their operations. And I think Microsoft did as well, but I'm not 100% sure. That's one of the biggest reasons why they're laying off thousands of people, thousands of jobs. So that's a really big deal to pay attention to. But other companies, Paramount, General Motors, a lot of them eliminated jobs. IBM yesterday announced they would cut thousands of jobs. So this is really fascinating what's occurring here. Okay, so, and then here we go. So just like I said earlier, the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is working with a temporary state of affairs regarding not having a lot of data to research with. Sorry about that. And quote, we're going to collect every scrap of data we can find and evaluate it and think carefully about it. So, and then there again, it's very limited data, but the data shows that the job market is still struggling, and that's why they're likely going to cut interest rates even more. So, in hence of that report, let's look up a financial analysis of the jobs report, just to get into the nitty gritty of what specific sectors were affected. Now, I know it's going to be a lot of specific, can't even speak correctly. I don't know if they're going to have a lot of specific job titles because this isn't a government report. This is just ADP, which is only focused on private companies, not public companies. So there may not be a lot more information than I just shared with you. But just in case, let's see if there's any other information that we can get into. Okay, it doesn't look like anything too new in the report. Let's see. Usually CNBC has some more coverage on this. But yeah, it's really interesting because I'm really curious to see what the next jobs report is going to be. If we ever have a BLS jobs report, considering how the government has been shut down for its longest point in the last, or ever. It's its longest period of time. I think 36 days and counting today. With the government having, I think, over 10 votes in the Senate to try to reopen the government. But it's come to an impasse because Democrats and Republicans are refusing to negotiate or come to terms. Obviously, oh, sorry about that. I meant to pause that. Obviously, there's a lot more moving parts that get very political. So I'm not going to get into that right now in this video because that'll go a long way. But let's see what CNBC has to say about the jobs report. Apologies about that. I think you all can't hear this. So now you should be able to hear it. Okay, let's okay, should be able to hear it now.
Looking at the ADP private payroll data, it's just out. Steve Leisman joins us with those numbers.
Numbers. What a thought. Yeah. Fantastic. ADP is saying that private payrolls grew by 42,000 in the month of October. We have to get used to is a relatively lackluster number that because we don't have the labor force growth. Is this a good number relative to the labor force growth? We don't know because we don't have the unemployment size. What I don't, the household survey, what I don't like is how we got here. And this is something that's a bit of concern here. Small businesses, less than 50 workers, losing 10,000. That is the third month in a row that they have lost workers here. Medium size, down 21,000, and large over 500. That's where the job gains are.
This is really fascinating. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to get a video analysis from financial professionals here, because this is something that I didn't read in the article or it didn't really show. This is really interesting because small companies with under 50 employees, so very small companies, they lost jobs. Medium companies have lost jobs, and large employers have gained jobs, despite the statistic I read about Amazon, UPS, Paramount, and other companies doing that massive layoffs of tens of thousands overall in the country. Large companies have shown a more stable labor force overall, and that in fact gaining 73,000 jobs. So just something that I wanted to clarify there.
I have a concern anecdotally that this is a potential tariff effect here where small business is being hurt. Also, perhaps at the consumer level, what's going on. Looking at by industry here, 47,000 for trade, transport, and utilities. That's interesting to me because I would think that would be a place that would be hurt when it comes to some of what's going on with the tariff world. Education, hospitality, and health services, that's the place we often get the job growth. Leisure hospitality, though, down 6,000. Information down 17,000. And just one more thing here. We have, I believe, the change in wage growth. And that's unchanged. And that's, what is that saying to you? Unchanged in 4.5% for job stayers, 6.7 for job changers. Tells you we're kind of like at a status quo or maybe a quiet period here in the job market. It's not going down, which would tell you there was a lot of slack in the job market, but it's also not going up, telling you it's tight. We may just be, what, can I say, Goldilocks? Is that fair to say?
It's running.
Yeah, I think that's a major concern in the economy as well. When you see, and like I stated earlier in the article, it stated exactly what this gentleman is reading on the screen here, that the wages are staying relatively stagnant. And I think that's a big problem when it comes to U.S. consumer sentiments. I haven't seen a poll on this recently, but just browsing, I've seen in the last month or so that U.S. consumers don't have a great sentiment when it comes to purchasing lots of goods, and they're holding back. I think I saw one recent thing in the news of that Americans aren't buying as much ketchup as used to, the Heinz ketchup. So Americans are pulling back, excuse me, much more so with consumer goods because of the prices of things, inflation, but also wage stagnation. And I think this is a really good point, because when we realize that November is coming, Black Friday, lots of shopping, the holidays, Thanksgiving, not a lot of gifts for Thanksgiving, but Christmas time with family, friends, and all that, there's going to be there may be a potential pullback on that, especially with the SNAP benefits not getting funding since November 1st due to the government shutdown. So I think we're going to see a lot of these events sort of, what's the term to say? A lot of these sort of like a domino effect. Each event is going to affect each other. And this is what makes this so fascinating with studying the jobs report and the economic events of downturns and how politics and the government and the stock market and the jobs market, inflation rate, the inflation report, the Federal Reserve, all these components affect you and me in so many ways that people don't imagine. So I think this is really important to really focus in on.
Hotter than
it's running better. People are making that. That's a great observation, Becky. And I also think that it's not declining, which would tell you there's a lot of slack in the labor market. I will say one more point, which is that this was about 20,000 more than expected. And it's also a nice turnaround from the prior month. But why listen to me when we have the unofficial commissioner of the Bureau of ADP Labor Statistics right here?
I think she's actually the official
title. The official right,
one to all of
right.
us. That's right. Neela Richardson is here. She is ADP's chief economist. And Neela, we are starved for information right now, so we're probably going to parse this 20 ways to Sunday. What is the big takeaways that you see from this data?
I think the first thing to note is the tepid recovery. We saw a loss in September. We actually put out a weekly pulse number last week showing and signaling a direction of tepid recovery. Now, as Steve mentioned, this is not the hiring rates that we saw at the beginning of the year. Far from it. But it is a recovery. It is not broad-based. We did see some gains in education and healthcare. We did note the gains in trade, transportation, and utilities. But there's some weakness. You see it in professional services. You see it in information services. And so, and when you think about the consumer, you see it in leisure and hospitality. And then the final point, again, Steve mentioned it, I'll put a little bit more data into it, is that 3 in every 4 workers in the United States work in a company with less than 250 employees. And so while big companies make headlines, small companies drive hiring. And so to see that weakness at the small company level is still a concern. And I think that's one of the reasons why the recovery has been so tepid.
Yeah. Miss Richardson, she makes a really great point here. And this is exactly the point I made a little bit, literally like a minute earlier, is that people get caught up in the headlines of saying, you should beware of big companies or beware of these big name conglomerates that are seeing tens of thousands of layoffs, like we saw with Meta a couple of years ago, we saw with Amazon currently right now, we're seeing with Microsoft, Google, all these companies, Google a couple of years back, not right now. And at the same time, though, on a national scale, what's really hurting most is these small companies that have less than 200 employees. Even less than 50 employees, they're hurting the most with the hiring process, and they usually are the backbone of the economy in a lot of ways.
What did you think of Steve's contention that this could be because of tariffs hurting small businesses more than mid or large businesses?
I think it's the cacophony of everything all at once. It could be tariffs and tariff uncertainty. It could be hiring. We think that small firms don't hire using H-1B visas sometimes. No, small firms are dynamic too. They're hiring talent around the world. And so that uncertainty could be a pressure point for small firms. But let's not forget the consumer. There's been so much talk about the K-shaped recovery. Well, that lower leg of that K did have some discretionary income for leisure and hospitality. That might be slowing. So there is a lot of things that could be affecting small businesses right now. The good news in terms of the overall macro story is it hasn't slowed down large company hirings to the same extent.
I'm going to make two very quick points. One is, if you were paying attention to CNBC a week ago Tuesday, you would have had the weekly ADP report, and that would have given you a heads up that things were had kind of turned around from the prior monthly report.
Okay, so now we'll transition into the next news here. So again, kind of with this news, it's a recovery. So the recap is there's a small but steady recovery in the jobs market. We've seen the jobs reports show a very sharp decline that really began in the summertime, but the report got revised all the way down in the fall when it was really bad in the summertime. And it's kind of ironic because that is when we saw all these huge gains in the stock market, breaking record after record after April with the Liberation Day tariffs, and after that was put off for another 90 days. But at the same time, that's when the jobs market was arguably at its worst this year. So now we're seeing a small recovery, which is a positive sign. So that's a good thing. And let's transition to the next article here, and that is from BBC. Conservative justices sharply questioned President Trump's tariffs in high-stakes hearing. So this is really interesting because when people talk about tariffs, most people don't understand what tariffs are, what it actually means for the American consumer. And when you look at it from a spreadsheet standpoint, you say, oh, you see that the U.S. government, or Americans, or us, the U.S. government, is seeing a positive flow of cash or income coming from tariffs. So from the outside, you think, oh, that's a great thing. It's great to have more tariffs because we get more money. But at the same time, that's a very macro lens of looking at this issue, because when you understand the reality of what tariffs are, you realize that it's in another way an extra tax, and that tax gets passed down to the consumer. And now the thing is, President Trump was trying to push back on this, saying that companies need to eat these tariffs. They need to eat these tariffs to bring prosperity to America. But that's not how business works. They're going to pass down that tax. So it's an import tax, and they're going to pass that down to the consumer because they don't want these taxes on their business to eat at their EPS, earnings per share, their revenue for each quarter when they report to their shareholders how they're doing. They don't want this big taxation to be eating up at their profits. So they're going to pass that taxation down to their consumer products, and that's what's going to happen. So that's part of the reasons why we saw inflation creep up to 3%, and likely a little bit higher, but we haven't had a chance to really review that information yet due to the government shutdown. So let's get into this. Let's see what arguments were being made, because they're questioning this case because of the power of the purse. I mentioned this yesterday in my live stream. So what this means, the power of the purse, is in the Constitution, it clearly states that Congress has the power of the purse of taxation taxation with representation, and any new taxes for law-abiding citizens must be passed through Congress, not from the executive branch. And the concern with these tariffs is that these are being unilaterally passed by the executive branch on the basis of an emergency, which I'll get into in this article. Hopefully they talk about it in this article here. And with that in mind, the issue is that this could potentially be a taxation without getting passed through Congress, because all these tens of billions of dollars that the government has made in revenue is at risk of getting refunded back to those countries if the Supreme Court rules it to be unconstitutional. I know it's a lot of information, so we'll break it down though. We'll break it down if you're a little bit lost, because I was a little bit lost reviewing it months ago. So President Trump's use of sweeping tariffs faced sharp questioning in the Supreme Court today in a case with major implications for the president's agenda and the global economy. So, and again, the justices have a 6-3 conservative majority. So that's something to really keep in mind here. And conservatives are generally have a much more strict interpretation of the Constitution. So that's something to really keep in mind here. And why, in my belief, we could potentially see these tariffs getting removed. But they've ruled in President Trump's favor in the majority of cases that we've seen this year, including immigration enforcement, and a number of other a number of other cases. So I wouldn't be surprised if it goes either way. So a majority of justices, including several conservatives, expressed doubts about the White House's justification of the import duties, which the president has said are necessary to restore America's manufacturing base and fix its trade imbalance, even though in the last or most of the year we saw contraction in manufacturing. So I'm not sure how true that is, but that is the claim of the president. So the measures are being challenged by a number of small businesses and a group of states which contend that the president has overstepped his authority in imposing the levies, which are in effect a tax. So let's go into the arguments here. So Amy Coney Barrett, who was appointed by Trump in his first term, she was appointed by Trump. She says, quote, "And so is it your contention that every country needed to be tariffed because of threats to the defense and industrial base? I mean, Spain and France. I could see it with some countries, but explain to me why as many countries needed to be subject to the reciprocal tariff policy as are." And this is the thing. This is not like President Trump was targeting one country one or several other countries like his first administration. This was a sweeping tariffs that were targeting dozens of other countries all around the world. And there's not a lot of factual reasons to target all these countries, especially allies as well. So I think there's a lot that needs to get breaking down here. And I think the Trump administration is going to have a hard time defending this, in my opinion. But again, if they're professional lawyers, I'm sure they'll figure it out probably. So let's see, arguing over country killing cases. So the case centers around a 1977 law. Okay, so this is the law that President Trump is using for these tariffs. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act that gives the president the power to regulate trade in response to an emergency. So Trump invoked this emergency law to tax goods from China, Mexico, and Canada, saying drug trafficking from those countries constituted an emergency. And that's probably why that he's been allowed to really use that as justification to enact these tariffs. And then again, he employed these levies from 10 to 50% on goods from almost every country in the world. This time he said this time he said the U.S. trade deficit, where the U.S. imports more than exports, pose an extraordinary and unusual threat. And this is the part that I think he's lost a lot of Americans, because when you look at a deficit, obviously when you see a deficit and you see that we spend more, and with a deficit, we are spending more money to buy items and we are selling less items, and hence we're buying more than we're selling. So we're spending more than we're getting in revenue, if that makes sense. So it doesn't make sense to tariff all these countries left and right due to having a trade deficit, because America is known for being a consumerist country. America is known, with the power of the dollar, the U.S. world reserve currency, using the strong value of the dollar to spend that money on items from around the world that are more cheap in manufacturing. They pay their workers a lot less, and you can get more with that dollar. That's why a lot of companies were a lot of them they moved their bases to Mexico, to all these other countries because of cheaper manufacturing. And it's not a great thing, but Americans themselves have benefited a lot from it, at least in purchasing cheap items. Now, we lost a lot of jobs in the process. That's really difficult and very terrible, and that's not good at all. Though I would say with that globalization, Americans are able to afford many more consumer items than many other developed countries. Just because we have the U.S. world reserve currency, the dollar, and we've been able to do that. So that's where I think that this case falls apart with using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. That's where I think this case falls apart, in my opinion. He may have a case when it comes to China, Mexico, and Canada with the drug trafficking. I don't know too much of those details, so I can't speak to that. But I think on the other part with the 10 to 50%, I think that's where the case falls apart, in my view, because you can't say that you have an unusual threat on every country in the world just from having a deficit itself, because the U.S. government has been running a trade deficit for many years, to say the least. Okay, so let's see. So the Solicitor General John Sayer looks like he's in the administration's defense, says it would expose the United States as a ruthless trade retaliation and lead to ruinous economic and national security consequences if these tariffs were reversed, pretty much is what that person's saying. So let's see what the implications of the case are. So Chief Justice John Roberts, so he was appointed by George W. Bush during his term in the early 2000s, quote, the justification is being used for power to impose tariffs on any product from any country in any amount for any length of time. Under the Constitution, America's founding legal document, Congress, not the president, holds the power to tax, and the court has traditionally set limits in how much of that authority it can hand over. If the court ruled for Trump in this case, Judge Neil Gorsuch, another conservative, wondered, quote, what would prohibit Congress from just abdicating all responsibility to regulate foreign commerce? Exactly. That's a great point. And this is where I think it can get very dangerous when any president can use an emergency case to basically do what they want. So and another example of President Trump doing this is using the emergency, I forget, I think it was the National Alien Enemies Act, something like that, where he declared war on a gang, and he used that as justification for having more law enforcement with immigration enforcement and all that, with deportations that weren't legal according to the Supreme Court, and that's a whole other case. But you understand my point with the Trump administration using the Emergency Powers Act to in other facets as well, not just with tariffs. So this is definitely a common theme that we've seen in 2025. So let's because this is very detailed here. So let's look into a we can find something on this. So let's see. Because I think there should be a lot of coverage on. So there's a 2.5 hour oral arguments from the Supreme Court. So definitely they've been talking about that for a while. I'd be really curious to actually hear that at some point. This video is 4 hours long. This is one from CBS News. Let's see what CBS News has to say about this.
All right, we continue to monitor today's major case at the Supreme Court. Justices are hearing arguments on the president's authority to impose tariffs on any international country. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman is live outside of the Supreme Court and joins me now to talk about it. Katrina, all right, here's where we're looking. Catch us up. What have we learned so far?
Hi, Vlad. Well, first of all, I'm out in front of the Supreme Court, and there is a long line of people here who are waiting to get into these arguments. This is such a big case that it's really drawing a crowd. But so far, there has been a lot of pushback. John Sauer is arguing on behalf of the Trump administration right now, and he's arguing to a court of originalists, of textualists, of people who rely on statutory interpretation. And Vlad, they keep asking him about the way he's trying to use the language here to regulate importation. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was pushing back a lot on him. She said, can you point to any place in the statutory code, in the history, where it was used to confer tariff authority? And she is someone who really, really is strong on statutory interpretation, Vlad. Another one of the justices just said that to have the president's power trump congressional power when it comes to taxation seems to neutralize those powers. So this is really a really key case about the balance of power. John Sauer has been arguing that the president has broad authority when it comes to foreign affairs, that he has the inherent power to regulate foreign commerce. He also said that these are regulatory tariffs. He said they're not revenue-raising tariffs. He said that that creates a distinction here, Vlad. So there's been a lot of pushback. There also
It's funny that he says that because we all know that President Trump is using his bully pulpit to promote tariffs as a means of generating revenue for the United States. He has his own slogan of the golden age, making America the golden age for the United States. He posts on Truth Social about it. So it is kind of ironic that the spokesman for him that's defending his case in the Supreme Court is stating that this is just for regulation purposes and not revenue generating purposes.
talking about the major questions doctrine quite a bit, which says you can't make rules on issues of vast economic or political significance unless Congress has specifically conferred that power. And then Sauer has also been hearkening back to a case related to Nixon. It was an earlier version of the law that IEPA now is, and Nixon had used that to invoke his ability to tax. And so the Trump administration is relying on that quite a bit, but the justices are really pushing back here.
Yeah, and so Katrina, the president's own words come back to torpedo this because the president himself has never framed the tariffs as regulatory in nature. The president has always framed the tariffs as
Exactly.
revenue generating. In fact, he talked about it yesterday where he says the tariffs are great for the United States and bringing in a lot of money to the United States. So I wonder if that has been sort of reflected back to Mr. Sauer. And then the other question, of course, becomes Congress's ability to regulate interstate and international commerce. Is the court, from what you're listening to, siding on the notion that you will erode more of Congress's authority and give that to the president?
Absolutely. There seems to be deep concern here about just giving that authority over to the executive branch when Congress has not specifically made that clear. That's this whole issue of the major questions doctrine, the pushback we're hearing about how this could potentially just neutralize the balance of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch, Vlad. And to what you were saying, I was thinking the exact same thing when I heard John Sauer saying that these are not revenue generating, because that is what we hear President Trump saying all of the time. So I haven't heard the justices mention it, but those are definitely words that could potentially come back to haunt him. Yeah.
All right. Katrina Kaufman, always great to have you, my friend.
So yeah, that's just some video analysis here. Let's see, okay, let's see this clip from Bloomberg, because I really like their analysis on how they really break down a lot of issues and go much deeper.
News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. And there's your closing bell for this Wednesday on Wall Street, where
let's check this one out. That's just a recap for the day, so this video should cover it.
This is probably the biggest case of the term, and some people have said this is the biggest case in decades.
Wow.
Because it's going to determine the president's authority. So this is about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA for short. And no president has used this to impose tariffs. It doesn't mention tariffs or duties in the language, but President Trump is saying that he can exert emergency power. So what the statute does say is that in unusual and extraordinary circumstances, a president can declare an emergency. Still not a question of whether it can be about tariffs, because that's supposed to be something that Congress does.
And also, the one thing I don't like about emergency is that it's up for interpretation. So one administration could say something's an emergency, another administration could say it's completely fine. So I think that's a little bit iffy, the word emergency, and that's where I think power can definitely become corrupt with sort of trying to hijack that term and use your agenda to speed roll through a lot of regulatory systems that we have in the United States.
So President Trump said that on one hand, the fentanyl crisis and then the deficit, the trade deficit, are extraordinary emergencies. And so the question is whether the Supreme Court will agree with that. 3 lower courts, including the International Court of Trade, which is known to know about trade, said, no, this is not, the president can't do this. And, there are briefs that groups submit called amicus briefs. And in this case,
well, I've been mispronouncing it my whole life.
I know, me too.
People also say amicus.
Okay,
So,
you're the expert.
No, well, I'm not a Latin expert. I haven't taken Latin since high school, and that was a long time ago. So, but there were 40 briefs against the tariffs and 10 for. And among the 40 were like the Chamber of Commerce, small businesses, law professors, former judges. So, I mean, if you look at the text, the Supreme Court should probably rule against the tariffs, but as we know, they often rule the way they want to rule.
And he did appoint a number of the Supreme Court justices, so there's
3.
that to consider as well. Exactly.
Yes.
So who exactly are the plaintiffs? Because it feels like this got rolled up into one big case.
Yeah. So the plaintiffs right now are small businesses. There is a wine exporter. There is a toy goods company. And, they're basically, and I believe that they had a sort of a draw for which lawyer was going to argue, and Neil Katyal, who was the acting Solicitor General. By the way, I think his hourly rate is up to $3,000 an hour.
Nice.
Yes, nice.
Yes.
If you're him, I believe he's going to argue for the plaintiffs, and the Solicitor General is on the other side, and he's won many a case for Donald Trump before the Supreme Court, even before he was president.
So the Supreme Court will hear arguments today. When will they issue a ruling, do you think?
That's the $1 million, or maybe the $1 trillion question in this case.
Right.
And that's a really great question that this gentleman asks, because I've seen headlines in the past, of course, with like lower courts that ruled against the tariffs. And I think the thing is, it didn't really make a huge difference in the stock market, or if it did, it wasn't a meaningful impact, because we all know that the Trump administration was going to keep appealing up to the Supreme Court. We all know that they're not going to just stop enacting tariffs because a lower court or lower circuit court or an appeals court states that the tariffs have been an overreach for the executive branch. So this is a really big question here. When is this case going to take place? Because sometimes it takes many, several months, several years. Will this case take place after the Trump administration's term is up in 2028? These are all valid questions. So
it's expected that because they put this on an expedited schedule, this was on the emergency docket, and they switched it over to this docket. They have it's called a special day for this. So it's expected that they'll rule quickly, but you never know. So the worst comes to worst, it would be the end of the term in June. It probably won't be that late, but if there are conflicting, if there are like dissenting opinions and concurring opinions, it can take a while.
Mm-hmm. So what happens today is that the Supreme Court begins hearing arguments on this. How long is that part of the process going to take?
It's probably going to be 2 hours. It used to be that Supreme Court arguments were an hour, and they had a clock and a light. And when
that's what I remember from TV and movies.
You were out, right? Now they can go on. It could go on longer than 2 hours. So it'll be interesting to see what the justices ask questions about, and the responses. And President Trump had said he was going to attend the hearings, and every lawyer I talked to said, "Bad idea, bad idea." And
oh my gosh, can you imagine Trump being in there trying to hold his composure together for over 2 hours? That would be wild. He would definitely be tweeting and all this stuff, all the comments he'd be making.
Now I think it's just Scott Bessent who's at the hearings.
Now we know President Trump doesn't give up a fight easily, and he is a very litigious person, always has been through his business career. If he loses at the Supreme Court, is that it for tariffs?
Well, it's not it for tariffs. It's it for tariffs under IEEPA, because the Supreme Court is as high as you can go, as you all know. So, but there are other ways that he can implement tariffs, and he has implemented tariffs in other ways. And apparently, the administration is looking for other things. So it's not the end. The question is whether they'll have to reimburse businesses for some of the tariffs that they've paid.
That's that's going to be a huge impact.
That will not be fast or easy. That's going to be a process.
It would be a process. I mean, it's been done before in smaller amounts, but that'll not be another question. And that's sort of hanging over the Supreme Court's head, because Donald Trump has been saying that it's the life and death of the country. I mean, he's been saying some extraordinary things about the importance of this case, and that's going to be weighing on the justice's mind somewhere in the back, I think.
Yeah, Paul, according to Bloomberg Economics, the U.S. is collecting $556 million daily in IEEPA tariffs.
Ooh, okay.
And by the end of 2025, it'll top $140 billion. Can you imagine trying to refund that?
Yes.
This is probably...
Yeah, that'll be wild, because that'd be something. Because it already takes the government a long time to do refunds and all that stuff, so that definitely wouldn't be surprised about that. That's why he's pushing it so hard. Okay. So we'll move on from this case here. So again, lots of arguments to be made here with the Supreme Court reviewing this case, and the fact that they generate, according to Bloomberg, over $500 million a day just on IEEPA tariffs alone is a huge number. So we're going to definitely see an impact on that, considering just how fast the U.S. debt crisis has gone. It's hit over $38 trillion. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to go around here. But let's go into this next article here from Bloomberg again. Let me make sure it's not behind a payroll. Okay, great. So Apple nears a deal to pay Google roughly $1 billion. $1 billion a year. Oh, $1 billion a year? Not just one time? Wow. For a Siri AI model. And I think this is a really great idea for Apple personally, because like I have an iPhone and I see myself not asking Siri certain questions, because all it does is it leads me just to other articles to read. And if I'm walking, if I'm going for a walk, if I'm not able to access that website in a timely manner, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use a quicker, more faster chat GPT or a faster AI model response. So I think this is a really great move from Apple to do this. I think they really need to do this, considering that they've been behind in the artificial intelligence development ladder of their business. So Apple Inc. is planning to pay about $1 billion a year for an ultra powerful $1.2 trillion, $1.2 trillion parameter AI model developed by Alphabet Inc., Google, that would help run its long promised overhaul of the Siri voice assistant. So this is completely rehauling how Siri is going to be implemented on the iPhone. And it's funny because so many people thought Siri was really awesome with how it's automated and it can do things for you. It can set an alarm for you, can send text for you, can play a song in an app. It does all these things. But with the advent of AI, OpenAI, the company, seeing all these AI models come out, it's kind of been in the background now. Like, no one talks about Siri in the same light anymore. And it makes sense. So let's continue here. Following an extensive evaluation period, the two companies are now finalizing an agreement that would give Apple access to Google's technology, according to the people who asked not to be identified with the deliberations that are private. The iPhone maker is banking on Google's help to rebuild Siri's underlying technology, setting the stage for a new state of features next year. The Google's model's 1.2 trillion parameters, a measure of AI software's complexity, would dwarf the level of Apple's current models. And this is what's interesting with Apple, and I like how innovative that Apple is becoming, that they're not being stagnant in this development race, really, to get as much technology in their systems as possible. Apple had previously molded using other third-party models to handle the task, but after testing Gemini, OpenAI's ChatGPT, and Anthropic's Cloud, Apple zeroed in on Google earlier this year, Bloomberg reported at the time. So clearly they believe that is probably one of the best models to use for Siri. So it's coming next spring. Okay. So, and then obviously I would imagine that shares would react positively to that, right? I guess not too much. So Apple gained less than 1%. So, but Alphabet got over 3%, obviously, because they're going to get over about $1 billion extra money in their business. So obviously that stock's going to go up. So that's no surprise there. So let's similar to what I've done in the other topics. Let's check an analysis on this here, because there's so much information on it, and I want to make sure that I get the details of it right. Because I think it's so easy to kind of read jobs reports, understand the numbers there, but things with artificial intelligence and all the data that's involved in really diving deeper into it, it's better to hear from
what is it that was so good, given the fact that this really is a hardware story, not necessarily a technology story, which is what's going on with the rest of the tech world?
Sure. I mean, look, if you look services, that continues to be rock of Gibraltar for them, and that mid-teen growth. I think that's something from a multiple perspective that investors are really focused on. But look, the reality is we've talked about it so many times in the show over the years, like other cycles have been disappointing from iPhone. If you look 15, 16, iPhone 17, it almost looks like a surprise upgrade cycle. Especially in China. China was the headwind, now looking like a tailwind. And then also it comes back to Cook. I mean, 10% politician, 90% CEO, playing nice in the sandbox in DC. That's going to have an impact as well. And this is all the drum roll to AI. I mean, that is what you're playing for here when it comes to Apple over the next year.
That's really fascinating. I have to say this gentleman's suit is very, very unique. I've never seen a suit and jacket like that, but I digress. Let's continue.
Is it? I mean, I guess that's really the key question. Is this still the promise of AI? Or is this really a question of we all have phones that are broken and cracked, and we've been waiting for a long time, and we're going to now upgrade to the i17. They are capacity constrained at this point, which was the biggest hamper for them. And it's a completely different story than the AI spend that we're seeing in the other companies, and a very different kind of trajectory than maybe what we're seeing in the other space.
Yeah, and that's been the frustration, right? Because, I mean, if you look at Apple, this AI party where it was 9 p.m., it's now 10:30 p.m., that party goes to 4 a.m. Apple, they've been out on the outside looking through the windows, right? So now the focus is consumer AI revolution. It's going to go through Cupertino. Now, how does that happen? Comes down to that Google DOJ win. That's huge. And now, candlelight dinner, Sundar, Cook, I believe it's a matter of time. They're going to announce a massive AI partnership on Gemini. That's what you're playing for, because you're 25% of what you're playing for is the stock's cheap relative to what I think could happen on an iPhone 17 services. But what you're really playing for here is they get to the AI party. They announce that deal over the next year. This is a $350, $400 stock as AI finally comes to Cupertino.
Doesn't that, though, completely not illegitimize, but basically challenge this idea that you have to spend in the AI race to keep ahead? If you have a company like Apple that basically figures we can partner with people, we don't need to spend, and we can still benefit, does that just show you don't need to participate in the arms race for every other company that is?
Yeah, look, I think for them, it's unique because there's 2.4 billion iOS devices, 1.5 billion iPhones. So they've built the mountain, right? The field of dreams. I mean, they've built it, they will come. So now it comes down to from a consumer perspective, you have to monetize that on the consumer perspective. I think AI revolution comes through Apple on the consumer side. When you look what's happening on the enterprise, look, it's a fourth industrial revolution. The reality is that from this tech earnings, going into eating chocolate tonight and Sour Patch Kids and whatever else on Halloween, you go in as a bull more bullish relative to everything we've seen from hyperscaler, Amazon, Microsoft, even Meta, stock down, but why is it down? They're spending more and more, and it speaks to our view. This is only second inning of the 9-inning game.
It's an interesting analysis that he has here, and I think that's a really good point he makes with the idea of how Apple is in a very unique position because they have such a huge global footprint with I think over 2 billion iPhones that people have around the world. I think that's what he said. I'm pretty sure. And so they have this huge base of consumers, and it's all about being bullish on that. Just as kids are bullish on Halloween when they get more candy, they have a huge bag. They don't have the candy yet, but they're expecting really good treats in their bag. And very similarly with Apple, people are expecting good things for the iPhone 17 when they go out, when they spend all their hard-earned money, their hard-earned cash on the newest iPhone models. They expect a really good product. And so to deliver on those expectations, Apple needs to partner with Google, partner with other companies that have huge artificial intelligence developments, technologies, systems, softwares to be able to really advance their iPhone.
It really changes, though, how you analyze these tech companies. If they are taking on AI servers and other relatively short-lived assets, it means that depreciation charges start racking up. Sure. How does that change how you think about these companies and the otherwise cost discipline that they need to exercise?
Yeah, and look, I think that's the debate, right? Because if you look at these companies over a year, then you wouldn't have bought even the last few years. But the reality is it's an AI arms race. You're essentially building out the new economy on the consumer, on the enterprise front. And that's why you have to be able to look out 2-3 years to what this is going to look like. Microsoft, a good example. I mean, you essentially have almost built a Microsoft within a Microsoft. You look what's happening at Google, right? New York State cab drivers bearish on Google and Alphabet. If you look back over the last 6 months, now when DOJ, search, death greatly exaggerated. That's actually a positive relative to AI. You look at Amazon, finally Jassy saying like, hey, don't forget about us. And that was a huge pop the champagne moment for them last night.
We saw
So not the best analysis, I'll be honest, on that video, but I think there's a lot more details of that deal that needs to be worked out. Let's see. So Apple, let's get into this article here and see if there's more details to sort of unpack here. So Apple's done in adopting Gemini to power AI features. Snap Inc. And several other major companies are building on Google's Vertex AI platform, but for Apple, the move marks an acknowledgement that it is fallen behind in AI, as clearly stated over this last year, with the stock not having a great return in the last year or so, from what I've seen at least. So Apple doesn't want to use Gemini as a long-term solution, despite the company bleeding AI talent, including the head of its models teams. Management intends to keep developing new AI technology and hopes to eventually replace Gemini with an in-house solution. So they're going to get that technology from Google, all the software that they have, use those systems to create their own sort of AI technology in their iPhones and their Apple products, which is very interesting. And I think that's definitely makes sense considering that Apple is a big name and they want to have a new sort of Siri, a new and improved version of Siri that is associated with Apple alone and not just a copycat version of Google, Gemini, or anything like that. So I think that is everything I'm going to cover today, looks like. I think that's pretty much all the news. Again, the government shutdown has hit it's 36th day, I believe. So it's the longest government shutdown in American history. So not great news, obviously, for the million workers that aren't receiving a paycheck, air traffic controllers, especially with the holidays coming up in Thanksgiving and December with Christmas time and all of that. So it's definitely going to be very difficult with travel and all of that. So we're definitely going to have to watch out and see what really impacts that's going to have, especially with SNAP benefits not being funded after November 1st, according to the news that I've seen. Now, a judge recently ruled that the United States government has to at least partially fund the SNAP benefits program, so it'll be partially funded. But again, that does not guarantee that millions of Americans will get SNAP benefits in November. So definitely something that we're going to have to pay attention to. With that, I believe there hasn't been any progress made from what I saw, so I'm not going to try to look it up. So again, please like, share, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for sticking around and watching my content. And and tune in for tomorrow's show.